This episode is brought to you by Rad Dudes Who Love Nature.
You shouldn't be able to do what you said, look through a forest and don't see anything.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Hey, podcast listeners, here's a quick note before we start the interview with Bernd Blasi. First thing, we mentioned one of his papers in the discussion. This was from Ecology and Evolution, November 2019, titled Red Oak Seedlings as Indicators of Deer Browse Pressure, Gauging the Outcome of Different White-tailed Deer Management Approaches. This is a paper he authored with Paul D. Curtis, Jason Boulanger, and Andrea Davalos. We also talked about how predators impact prey species populations, and though we didn't mention the specific paper, you might want to dive deeper into the discussion with another of Dr. Blasi's papers, Myths, Wishful Thinking, and Accountability in Predator Conservation and Management in the United States, which came out in Frontiers in Conservation Science in June of this year. Last thing, I forgot to remind everybody to buy my book, Exploring Philly Nature, A Guide for All Four Seasons, which you can get straight from Temple University Press, from all the usual online booksellers and local bookshops in the Philly area. Now, on with the episode. Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. We got one of the two co-hosts here today, Billy Brown. Tony is on the road and unable to make it. And we're going to dive into a topic that we've touched on a bit in some other past episodes that we've done about hunting in urban settings, looking actually mostly at the Philadelphia area where we're based. And some of that has been talking to hunters and sort of exploring what is, maybe the oldest way that humans connect to nature and how that happens in a city. And then some of it, the discussion that we've had has also been about it. And then this is a tricky thing to define. So you can hear my gears turning as I say this, but overpopulation of deer, and a lot of ways people can talk about what is an ideal population level of deer in a place. But in terms of its impact, their impact on forests, and what we see in Philadelphia, and people see in a lot of settings where you have high densities of white-tailed deer. So we've talked about hunting as a method for trying to do something about that problem. And so I was, researching stuff like you do, looking around online, and I found a paper which gets at a lot of this, and it was called Red Oak Seedlings as Indicators of Deer Browse Pressure, Gauging the Outcome of Different White-tailed Deer Management Approaches. And I reached out to the lead author, Bernd Blasi, and he was generous enough to come on the podcast and talk about what I expect will be a wide range of stuff. I'll start with some basic questions, but it's a conversation. We can wander a little bit, and this is also not simple stuff. Some of it might be in the sense of how do deer affect how trees grow and how many deer might affect that. But so many articles I've read about this and people you talk to, that this notion of what is like the right amount of any animal to have on a landscape can be like trying to nail Jello to the wall sometimes. But this paper and the research gets at the question of how the deer impact forests, and so that's we're going to start off with that focus, I think, in the conversation. I'll ask Bernd, could you introduce yourself? Tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I'm a professor of the natural resources and the environment at Cornell University. Traditionally, so this is a little long-winded thing, I'm an entomologist by training. I grew up in northern Germany, came to the US some 30 years ago, doing control of invasive plant species. I worked on purple loosestrife, a wetland invader. I helped introduce insects to control the spread and impact of purple loosestrife. veered out into looking at introduced plant species in forest situations and then deer forest themselves onto my agenda. So because conservation in eastern forests or through much of the US is basically impossible at current deer abundances. And so I started researching the effects and how deer interact with introduced earthworms or introduced plant species. And all of a sudden it became very, very clear that what others had reported before, we need to do something about deer. So I started doing that. I'm now also the chair of the Cornell Deer Management Committee, so how we manage forests at Cornell University. I work with a number of municipalities around the Ithaca area where I'm located in New York State, but also in other states, and trying to help them implement ways of reducing deer impacts. And so that's how I got into that one. I'm still doing invasive plant management and control. I'm the director or the PI on what's called the New York Invasive Species Research Institute, that is a link between researchers and people that do invasive species management, particularly invasive plant management. So I'm an ecologist of many different colors, looking at, I would call it relationships between humans and their environment, the species, plants, and others, trying to understand how we can reform relationships that overall creates healthier living conditions for everybody involved. So that's my little spiel here. Yeah.
It's a great spiel. And so I'll start with the basic thing, like, something you just mentioned in your introduction. What is, just for people who haven't really thought about this much, when you talk about the impact of deer on forests, what's sort of the summary, like why is it a problem that there are lots of deer in eastern forests? What does it do to the plant growth, I guess, in those forests, to narrow it down that way?
Well, so historically, let me just reach out a little bit. When white Europeans first came, they found something that very often was called a paradise that was full of native peoples, full of white-tailed deer, full of other organisms, including deer predators, bears, mountain lions, wolves. Everybody was here and made some kind of an existence. And then Europeans transformed the landscape and affected biota in many different ways that we see in the legacy of, right? So mountain lions, wolves were extirpated. Deer were almost extirpated 120 years ago, and then they came under increasing protection. That was due to market hunting and other things. So forests were cut down, then they regrew, then we built cities into the developing forest, all these kind of things. Species were introduced. And so we have a completely transformed landscape over the last 300, 400, 500 years, introduced industrial agriculture. All these things happen almost simultaneously. Deer, once they came under protection, were no longer hunted for markets. They did what deer do. Does producing two fawns eat what they can. And so they expanded their populations. Then we have climate change in addition to that. So the hard winters that maybe you remember, I don't know. I do remember hard winters in the 60s.
As I say, I grew up in the Columbus, Ohio area in the 80s, okay. And we used to have we'd have snow days. We'd also have wind chill days when the wind chill would get, I think it was below, I don't know what it was, below freezing or below some degrees below freezing, which is an unimaginably low temperature right now.
And so what we have seen, what we have seen throughout the U.S. and worldwide is a change in climate, largely a warming. And one of the big killers of deer populations or of other ungulates, whether that's elk or reindeer, or caribou, is strong winters where you have snow cover, low temperatures for very extended periods of time. That's a massive killer. And so that doesn't happen anymore. So you have this confluence of many different factors: subsidies that agriculture provides, subsidies that gardens are providing, reforestation people replant their gardens, no predators. All of these things play a role. And deer were just building large populations that found our suburban areas or increasing urban areas very amenable. And they can live long lives if they can avoid cars, right? So that's basically the situation that we're facing. So they're building huge populations, and the hungry mouths that we have running around are making life difficult for many other biota. That's not just the plants that they're eating, but through work that I have done or my team has done and many other people, we see not only the impacts on plants and the ones that are being eaten, but also deer favor introduced species, including earthworms, including lots of other plants that may be undesirable. They have problems for amphibians, problems for birds, problems for other mammals, Lyme disease, road safety, economic impacts. So it's just something that has been really, really difficult to comprehend how strong of an effect they're actually having on our forest ecosystems. And most of the time, that's it's underappreciated or unknown in many instances. I was surprised how little was really known, but the strong effects deer have because people were not making these connections between deer and introduced plants or introduced earthworms or birds or mammal communities. That has been largely understudied because people in science and in ecology tend to work in isolation, right? So there are folks that study plants, there are folks that study wildlife, which is largely vertebrates, there are folks that study birds, and there are folks that study insects. And that limits the ability to make these connections between all the interacting factors that are there. And so that's kind of where I live as a scientist and as a researcher. So I never thought that would be like a silver bullet for affecting conservation or well-being. Deer seem to be the key mechanism in eastern forests and way beyond the Northeast that drive all these relationships. And at the current abundances, it's detrimental. So deer eating other species out of house and home, they no longer have the ability to thrive in the landscape that are having high deer populations.
And so, I think listeners might also be aware of parks near where they live. In Philly, there are plenty of these. I'm sure they're in other urban areas also where, you present two pictures you might see while you're out hiking in a wooded park, and one might be an amazing what to me is an impressively clear view you get from about breast to 4 feet or so down to the ground level where there's not much vegetation. And then you might have an understory which has a lot of species that aren't from here, like lesser celandine, which is like a little buttercup, or garlic mustard and stuff like that. That's one of the ways you see the deer browsing pressure at work. And then compare that if you're in a park. This is what I started thinking about initially, is that might have deer exclosures put up. And we have several of those in Philly parks, where and some of them I think are somewhat experimental in terms of how they're being used by the Philadelphia park system. But the idea is that if you keep deer out, then you see you'll see a difference perhaps in the vegetation inside versus outside of the deer exclosures. So it's something if you're out there and you're going on a hike this weekend, and you want to get a sort of very material impression of what we're talking about, that's one way to do it.
Let me comment. Can I comment on some of those?
Please do.
Because there's a couple of important considerations. So one thing is you shouldn't be able to do what you said, look through a forest and don't see anything, and your view is basically impeded, right? So you can look from Philadelphia almost away to Boston if you were able to see that far with the deer impacts. So the deer will crop vegetation down, and so that creates your clear view. In eastern forests, that should not happen. There should be all kinds of species that are intermediate, not just the top trees and the vegetation, whatever it is on the ground. So that's one thing. We call it like a browse line. It goes as high as the deer can stand on their hind legs because that's what they're doing to do that. And I want to comment on the deer exclosures because it's a little tricky. So if you were to say, hey, we have a park, deer are too high in abundance, I want to protect that, so I'm building a fence. And for the first 3, 4, or 5, maybe even 10 years, you would not necessarily see a difference if you don't do restoration, if that fence is in an established forest. And then you could conclude, hey, the deer didn't do anything, right? Because inside and outside basically look the same. These deer exclosures also need to be larger than the typical ones that I see. In part, that's explained because deer have sorted out the plant communities to the ones that can exist with high deer abundances, right? That could be introduced species or really small ones that don't grow very tall where the deer would eat them, or unpalatable ones. We made those same observation when we started doing all this at West Point at the military academy. We put our fences up and said, wow, nothing happens unless we plant something on the inside. Individuals that are on the inside may be growing, but it takes an enormous amount of time if you don't cut the forest. So if you were to put deer exclosures up after trees were cut and there's light and resources, you will see a difference, very dramatic. But if you just put a deer exclosure into an existing forest and say, hey, let's study what the impact is of deer, it may take a very long time to realize that. So you shouldn't erroneously then conclude, hey, deer didn't do anything because I don't see a difference after a couple of years inside and outside. So
Gotcha.
there's a problem with that. But otherwise, the best place to see what it would look like if you do not have deer is go to Central Park in New York City. Well, that's all planted, but there are no deer, right? So when we looked at places to study that would have no deer, all of a sudden we were going to inner large cities where there may be parks where there are no deer. I don't know the situation in Philadelphia where you have places in the inner city where there are no deer. So you're shaking your head.
Everywhere we've got a park that is not intensively landscaped, we've got tons of deer. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's the same, Manhattan is an island, but they're coming in from the north through the Bronx. And so Central Park does not have any deer, does not have Lyme disease, does not have any ticks. And so occasionally one lands on a bird or something else because they're being dispersed, but they have all their rodents, rats and mice in New York City are not unheard of. And so that does exist, but there's no Lyme disease in New York City, in Manhattan. That's one of the few places where you could see what it would look like if you don't have deer and you have this mixed understory. There's all kinds of other factors, right? Foraging of humans all over the place in Central Park. So there's an impact with that. But it's one of those islands where everywhere else you have super high deer numbers. And so it has been really, really difficult for us as researchers to find places that we could go to and assess what it would be like if there are not these large numbers of deer. And it has been basically impossible. We can't go to Canada and study it in the boreal forest because there's no deer there, but that's way far north. It's no longer the same ecosystems that we study. So it has been very challenging in that way to find places to say, hey, here's a good place for comparison, right? Because deer have colonized all the places.
So now we've established why one might want to see what would happen if you had fewer deer and what that would mean for the forest. So then you get to the question of what do you do about it? And I'll throw a couple things at you that given what your research might be like softballs, but are things that come up a lot. And the two first things I hear when I'm talking to somebody about this, one is someone who isn't in love with the idea of killing deer, which is a lot of people. And one idea might be, hey, natural predators should handle this, not humans. And then the other thing you hear is, well, what about birth control? And so and you've experienced studying both of these. and so I'll toss them at you. So why not? Why do humans have to get involved in some way with controlling the deer populations lethally?
Do you have any idea how many deer there are in Philadelphia? Does anybody have any inkling? Did somebody throw out a number? Do you
I don't have it handy. I mean, our park system has they'll put out reports about the culling efforts, and in there they refer to the density per square mile, but it's certainly well above, let's say, 10 per square mile, which is I see sometimes the rule of thumb for a target for deer management.
So we're talking areas around here
like 100 plus per square mile. Yeah.
Okay. So let me address the first one about predators, right? So let's just assume that we would welcome mountain lions or cougars and wolves and bears in our midst.
I would, but I don't know about everybody else. Yeah,
that's right. So when we have just completed a survey and we're in the process of publishing that, whether wolves or mountain lions would be welcome in your neighborhood. So not asking New York residents whether it's okay to release wolves in the Adirondacks and the people in the Adirondacks deal with them. We asked them specifically, would wolves and mountain lions be welcome in your neighborhood? So not in somebody else's neighborhood, your neighborhood. The acceptance is around 30%, so not many people want them. And so you can kind of know a little bit about that. So the second thing is a wolf typically eats about 20 deer a year. So you can kind of anticipate if a wolf eats 20 deer and you have 100 deer per square mile, that means you need at least 5 wolves per square mile to do that. So because they need to, mostly to kill the old and the young. And there are areas where you have many more than 100 per square mile. That's what we had areas here that were 120, 140. So let's say, 3 to 5 wolves per square mile. That's a heck of a lot of wolves that would be roaming through Philadelphia. Again, it would be to make a difference. So what we see in forest situation and others, and we've worked through that, the number of wolves that we would need on landscape at present deer abundances, even if you have mountain lions and bears on top of that, you would never be able to do that because they are territorial, they're defending areas. Territories may be 100 square miles, so that's 1,000 deer or something like that. So even if they would be able to navigate urban landscape or suburban landscapes and would be welcome in those neighborhoods, which is all questionable right now, right? So there's no hope for the typical predators that you would have to be able to reduce deer numbers effectively to a level where it's way below 10 per square mile, where then other organisms, forests could recover and flourish in there. So there's very little hope that introducing or allowing predators to recolonize areas, that would result in a reduced impact by the deer. Now, I'm still in favor of, like you, right? I would welcome
just because
deer control predators in my landscape. I'm much more rural probably than you are here, so I would love to look out of my window and see a pack of wolf cruise through our area. That's me. I'm one of the 20 or 30% of people that would welcome them in the neighborhood, but that's more for like general conservation purposes that have other functions other than just reducing deer. So that's the first thing. So no hope for predators to solve the dilemma that we have created as humans. So next thing then is birth control. So for me personally, I feel that's a violation of a wild animal. We do spaying and neutering of our domestic, of our pets, of our livestock or other things, right? Whether that's appropriate or not, I'll leave it up to the people that are doing it. For a wild organism, you going in and doing sterilization or birth control, for me, it's a violation of the free will of the organisms that are running around. That's one. It's an ethical and moral thing that I have. Second one, it doesn't work. So because what you do, all the people that are promoting this, I understand, yes, you do not want to kill an organism that's charismatic and is beautiful and is part of the North American landscape. Yes, it should be. And the deer didn't play a role in that. It was all us doing that. Yes, you can prevent does from becoming pregnant. That can be either by capturing them, using ovariectomies, because tubal ligation, they sometimes regrow their tubes. We have seen that. So that's not effective in that sense. So that means surgery. That's hundreds of dollars with the deer coming into a mobile or like a real ICU, right? And then you remove the ovariectomies, and then you release them back out into the wild. So by not becoming pregnant, by not raising fawns, deer live for very extended periods of time, because those listeners that raise kids will know how much that means in terms of resource expenditure and energy expenditure that you have. So the deer that do not raise offspring live longer. So we have that here. They can live 15, 16, 17 years, crossing major highways on twice every day. So they're continuing to eat. And what we would like to prevent is them having an impact on the landscape. So there, while sterilization, the pill, you can't administer that. You would need to give it to the does on a frequent basis. That doesn't work because you don't know which doe is what, and you get them once, and then you will never get them again with a dart rifle or under a net. Or
smart that way. Yeah,
they're very, very, very smart. They immediately respond to that, so you will not be able to recapture them. So yes, you can prevent that those are giving birth, but by doing that, you are not affecting the population. What people hope for is that over time they would shrink, but it may take 20, 30, 40 years of continued devastation in our forests. For me, that's unacceptable. And the mortality that you have, while I understand that individuals may be opposed to killing a deer, you leave it to the cars. That's devastating for the deer, right? That's not a quick death. The ones that you see lying at the side of the road, they basically had it good because they died instantaneously. Right. What we know from the deer that we have collared here, and when we find them, they're crawling, they're living for days in agony until they die a slow death or being taken down by coyotes or whatever you have. I don't think that that's anything that anybody should favor, that we are leaving the killing to the cars. It's not going to work.
And then I'll chime in with one little thing, which is something that I read once in a historian of fire ecology, I guess, or fire, Stephen Pine, who had a great point where he said we should consider humans to be natural predators as well, in the sense that since the last ice age, humans have been one of the primary predators of deer in North America. And so that's a whole, we could get a whole, I'm sure, long-range conversation about what is the role of humans and what is natural, but we've been part of the picture for a long time.
That's right. We're part of nature. We're part of the consumers of deer. We're part of the consumers of plants and other animals. And so we cannot live outside nature. We affected nature, right? And so I sometimes hear the argument, let nature take care of itself, right? So, well, in part, we're part of nature, so that's fine. Free-range venison is one of the most delicious things that you can eat for those of you that will eat animal protein. There are some vegetarians that would not. That's fine. That's a personal choice. And so the deer are made to live and be able to deal with predation. That's just fine. We are part of that. It's our responsibility. We messed it up. And so if we say leave it to nature and we take ourselves out of the picture, we may not like the nature that we're getting with denuded woods where it's just shrublands and introduced species, right? I think we have a responsibility also for the native species that are now threatened by high deer numbers, right? Again, the responsibility is with us, but we have some ethical and moral responsibilities to protect them from being eaten out of house and home.
Right.
So whether that's the birds, whether it's the amphibians, whether it's other plants, they have a right to exist. And if the deer, through no fault of their own, are so abundant that they eliminate living spaces for native organisms, I think it's our moral obligation to do something about it.
All right. So now I'm going to throw another question at you that I hear a lot in this discussion from, let's say, the folks who are hunters, which is, well, let us take care of it. Whether it's and I have now through this and through various other friends, I have friends who are urban bow hunters in Philly, because you can't really shoot firearms in Philadelphia. And so especially if you listen to a lot of the popular media that's part of the hunting world, the idea is, okay, well then let's hunt them more, and that should take care of it. And so I think this is one of the things that drew me to your research, was you testing that. And so talk a little bit about the limitations of sort of what I think of as the recreational hunter being able to play a role in taking care of the deer populations.
Yeah, I wish that would be the case, that you could just deploy hunters and particular bow hunters in suburbia, and they could take care of the problem. I'm a bow hunter by heart, so that's how I got into. I never wanted to get part of but so that's a passion of mine. So I understand that, but the important question then is, if you allow responsible, safe bow hunting in the parks and places, Philadelphia or any other place, would the removal by hunters result in so much deer mortality that you would make a difference in the well-being of the forest that you would like to protect? And the answer to that is no. Unfortunately is no. And we tried to do this here at Cornell. We tried to do it in a number of different communities where I have helped implement suburban deer hunting approaches, where we did initially just allow recreational hunting, and hoping that there would be a difference that we could, and not just assume that, but also measure it. And so that's how you got into the paper that you quoted at the beginning. And we even did a combination with sterilization and others, and it just turned out not to result in the outcome that we desired. So make no mistake, hunters will take a whole bunch of deer, but never enough. And there are many reasons for that. One is it's a very short season typically. Even if you were to extend the season, hunters are not going out, or the vast majority of them are not going out and shooting deer after deer after deer after deer, even if you were to allow that to happen by issuing additional tags or something like that. They stop typically, short of 2 deer, one for their own freezer, and then they hand out to some of the friends. There are some individuals that are doing more because they see, hey, there's a reason why we're doing this here. So they may be shooting a few more. And there are some very dedicated folks that maybe kill a few dozen a year. Those are very far and in between. So the numbers just don't add up. And then there's deer education that comes into the mix. You would think that suburban deer are easy to kill because you can walk up to them. They may come up to you. Listeners that live in suburban environments, they're basically tame. But you will see they know whether a dog is within a virtual fence or on leash. They know how far they can go. Deer here in our neighborhoods look left and right before they cross the street. And so they have adapted very smartly to the environments that we provide for them. Once you start pressuring with hunting, or you capture them once to mark them or administer birth control or whatever you do, forget getting your hands on them again. They become educated very, very quickly. So So cheekishly, I say the dumb ones are in the freezer very quickly. And then you deal with all the smart and educated ones because they see what is happening, right? They're moving in family groups or others. Individuals out of those groups are being killed. And so they adapt their behavior. They become nocturnal. We know it from when the gun hunting season starts. They're becoming entirely nocturnal. It takes multiple weeks for them to trust the environment and the safety again that they venture out during the daylight. There's always a couple of individuals that will do that, so you can take those. But the majority of the deer are killed on the opening weekend, regardless of where you are, whether you're in New York or whether you're in Pennsylvania, in terms of the numbers being killed by hunters. So it doesn't work. Hunters do not remove enough from the landscape. Even when we've adapted our approach to then say, okay, if they're night active, maybe we can do night hunting, and we draw them in using bait and others. So this is more like a culling operation that you would have. That does work, and it gets better, but we can't do that everywhere. And so even with those situations, and almost like a 5-month season where we start in October and end in March, we are not able to remove sufficient numbers of individuals to really make a fundamental difference, because we cannot do it on a landscape level. We do it like in a little municipality, a few square miles, right? You could think about doing it in a park in Philadelphia, but the deer from outside realize, oh, there's fewer individuals in the park. Maybe I go there, and then they hang out. So we are suffering, so to speak, from the ability of deer to disperse, occupy new territories, find places where they find better living conditions. And so you get to the effect that it's a donut hole, right? But that donut hole fills up by the individuals from the outside.
If I recall from
you
your
need
paper,
to do it at land.
Yeah, you guys were taking out basically the equivalent of the entire adult population annually to see an impact on on how hard they browsed the oak seedlings.
Yeah, we could do that early on, but we have some communities around us, although it gets better, that do not do deer management for the reasons that maybe you have cited. They think there's public opposition, although once you ask people whether they have the willingness to tolerate increased deer kill for ecological, human health or other reasons, over 70% of people are in support of that. We just redid this survey in New York, and an overwhelming majority of individuals will say, hey, if the other species have a better well-being, wild plants or animals, or we have less suffering by the deer that starve in the winter or something, they will be accepting that. But we hear the loud voices from those folks that are opposed to killing. They seem to be always winning out. And then, you leave the killing to the cars. And so we are suffering from that effect, that there are some municipal leaders that are not willing to go in and stand up for what I believe they should. And I just say, no, we have too much opposition when it's less than 10 or 15% of the people that are doing that.
So another direction of criticism in the piece that I have found interesting, because just as someone who lives in Pennsylvania, where there's a very strong hunting culture once you get outside of the cities, is how the state game agencies manage deer populations. And I see this even I'll give an example. I have a friend who has a cabin in a rural county in northern Pennsylvania, where if you looked now at the very beginning, it isn't even open season yet there for bow hunting. There are no more tags available for doe. So basically, as many people are signing up to hunt as the state will allow to hunt. And if you go to his property, which is forested, there's tons of deer. They're really easy to just observe visually. And you look at the forest, you have a lot of Japanese stilt grass. You have a lot of areas that are just hay-scented fern. The browse lines we were talking about before. Clearly, there's a ton of deer. And so the state game agencies, in my phrasing of it, if they try to permit more take of deer, they hear about it from hunter advocacy groups who are also loud in their own way. And so just talk a little bit about like what you think would need to happen on the state game management level to see some kind of landscape level decrease in deer densities.
Yeah, so Pennsylvania is a little bit of a sore spot. So there have been all these controversies with the introduction of antler size restrictions, right? I don't know whether you have followed those debates. Gary Alt was basically needing police protection because hunters were very upset about not being able to shoot small bucks, or the increased focus on taking some does to allow the herd to recover and the vegetation to recover. It's all very, very strange to me, because people say, oh, we shouldn't shoot more does because then there are fewer deer in the landscape, and every little buck that you have will get into a monster buck and then have like 12, 14 points at some point if we just allow him to be old enough. And nobody thinks about the resource base, right? And so over time, the quality of the forests in northern Pennsylvania, what we call the southern tier, you may call the northern tier, right? Southern tier is on the New York side, but has greatly eroded. The capacity of forests to promote high deer abundances has just been browsed to pittance, nothing there. The Pennsylvania Game Commission chose a few years ago to look at seedling abundance and said, well, if the seedlings are abundant enough, then we can say, is this okay as the deer abundance and balance with whatever forest regeneration you want to have, when clearly and so they only show some areas around you, Philadelphia, other places, the urban corridor, right? So where seedling abundance is not high enough. Clearly all the other work shows it's not the seedlings that are threatened. It's the transition from a small seedling that's maybe up to a foot tall to then become a sapling and ultimately become a mature tree. That's where the deer are sorting it out. And so there's lots of work that has been done showing that sapling abundance throughout much of Pennsylvania, including the rural areas, is too low to allow forest regeneration. So the Game Commission caters towards some very loud folks. Less than 10% of Pennsylvania's populations are hunters and buy hunting licenses. But traditionally, that's what the Game Commission, not only in Pennsylvania, state wildlife agencies across the board have been doing. And so they basically have mismanaged all of Pennsylvania to favor the interest of recreational hunters. And they have a loud voice. So what we try to do with the paper that you initially referenced is trying to change the way that we think about it by being accountable, by actually measuring the right things, reporting the right data, because most people will not know that there are too many deer that are preventing forest regeneration. You and I are interested in the topic, right? You as the hobby, me as a professional one. But most people, particularly in urban areas, may say, well, I have no idea whether there are too many deer or too little deer. That's not what I think about on a daily or even weekly basis, maybe not even on a monthly basis. And hey, people have different interests. But the management agency should deliver the information that's appropriate for us to assess then whether they're managing in appropriate ways, not just for the 10% or 8% of the populations that are actually hunting.
So I'll say a couple quick things and ask you one last question. Something that's occurred to me as I've walked around our forests in the Philadelphia area, and you sort of look at the age of the trees that you're looking at, especially look at some that have fallen or been cut down across a trail or something like that, count the rings. My impression of it is what we're looking at are trees that grew up when there weren't very many white-tailed deer around. And then you can get lulled into the sense of, oh, this is a big, healthy forest. We have all these big trees. But those big trees grew up before we had the densities of white-tailed deer that we have today. So it's just a visual way people can go out and get a feel for this. But since we're running low on time, I want to just throw one last question at you, which is, what would your ideal management regime look like? So if you were the god of deer management in eastern states, what would it be? Sort of intensive, sort of culling operations to keep the population levels low? Like what would you if you wave your magic wand? What would you want to see?
I don't want that job, but that's that would be my first response. But so if I have a dream of how we would manage that, there's a combination of things that would need to happen, right? One is the establishment of groups of people that come together and say, what would we like in the landscape? Not on a park by park basis, that may be possible as well, but say, what is it? This is what we would like to have. And what would we need to measure to then say, are we getting to the place that's better? So in some places, you may want to protect orchids. In some places, you want to say, maybe I would like something different. Maybe I want to do agriculture or something else. What the size of that area is, I do not know, but we need to agree on, hey, we would like to have some trees that grow up. We would like to have some birds that can make a living here, whatever the metrics are. We're working on some of that. And then you would do deer management to trying to see whether that works. From everything that I have learned, using recreational hunting, sterilization, predators, it's not going to work. So most likely what we will need to do is create incentives for professionals to go and shoot deer for us, and then measure whether we're making a difference to get towards a healthier forest or ever. Most likely we will need to introduce market hunting again, but regulated market hunting, where the individuals that go out can sell that meat either to an approved butcher shop or something of that sort. That would need to be developed, right? But without providing incentives for individuals to go and take more deer and make a profit out of that one, we'll never get to the places where we want to go. There's a model like that, a little bit like that in Switzerland, because people would complain, if you have professionals in there to shoot all the deer that the recreational hunters would take. I would do the following. I would say, hey, all you recreational hunters, you have first crack at the deer. Go shoot the deer that you want. And then we have some kind of a harvest quota that we say, this is what we need to do based on over time on what we see in terms of forest improvement. If you don't get to that harvest quota, then the professionals go out and try to reduce that. You're not going to have willy-nilly people in state parks or in municipal parks running around. That will be highly regulated. I assume that's how parks manage that in Philadelphia. It's not everybody can just go when they want. It's very highly regulated already, just to make sure that it's done safe, and they may need to pass a test or whatever. So that's done with red deer management in alpine forest in Switzerland, where they say, hey, we need to reduce the numbers. You recreational hunters, go out there, do whatever you do. But you have to report all of that, and we will see how many you took. And then we have the professional hunters go out and reduce the numbers so that's tolerable. That's probably a system in the way that it needs to be incentivized so that people are actually shooting more deer because it becomes part of their livelihoods, right? So that's the ideal scenario. It will differ. And I never talk about deer numbers because it differs between Philadelphia, Alabama, Saskatchewan, or where we are. Deer have different sizes. There's different productivity of landscapes. Something in the Adirondacks, and you say 10 deer per square mile in the Adirondacks, that's probably twice what is being tolerable because their fertility is low, winters are long, climate is different. You go to a drier place or a wetter place, the numbers do not match up. The impact is what we should be concerned about, right? And that's what we need to measure. And that's what management agencies are not doing right now. They just assume we allow recreational hunting and everything is hunky-dory, which we know is not. And so they're not rising to the task. And so we need to take the privileges away from the hunters. They are part of our community. I'm not going to take recreational hunting away. I wish they would do more. So let's incentivize that, but they also have responsibilities. But typically, hunters do not consider themselves managers. That's their recreation. It's their hobby, and that's just fine. So I'm part of that crew, but I also see other significant responsibilities that we have collectively for the well-being of other organisms. Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll wrap up with that. well, with 3 minutes, I just want to throw something in just to say that
We can go a couple of minutes longer.
Oh,
It's not
okay.
a problem.
I was just going to say that for those who are new to the world of hunting, what Bernd just described it sounds quite reasonable to my brain. But when there is a almost religious attachment to what people refer to as the North American conservation model.
Yeah.
And so I I can see you getting beat up in certain places by making that kind of argument. But it is in my own head. It's something to really contemplate. Is how do we sort of have this kind of like results based focus? It's going to require a heck of a shift in the imagination of policymakers, and you've sort of brought me on board in a way, but
the North American model of wildlife conservation, that's what the official name is, just a code of conduct, right? It's an agreed upon thing. It's not a law, but all state wildlife agencies would articulate, we follow the North American model. Now, if you look at how deer management was created, it was at the time, as you said, where the trees grew up because there were no deer. Deer were introduced to Pennsylvania from Michigan and other places, trying to restock. Iowa and Kansas, a paradise for big buck hunters right now, had no deer left in the late 1800s, right? So then deer recolonized from the refugia. And so the state wildlife agencies and the mantra that they were following was, we need to protect the herd, we need to grow the herd. And if hunting is, or shooting is one of the major threats, by curtailing the number of deer that can be taken, you can protect that. They did that very effectively. They did it very effectively with waterfowl as well. But now we are at a situation where there are so many that you cannot regulate it with hunting anymore. So that's the same for, so hunting, if that's the biggest threat to a population, you regulate hunting, you can allow populations to recover. Great. But the example of snow geese or of Canada geese, right? Suburban Canada geese, you can no longer regulate them with hunting because there are so few hunters out there, and they can shoot, I don't know, what's the bag limit for some of them, 25 a day or so. You cannot take enough individuals off the landscape to prevent the deterioration. For urban Canada geese, you will have that problem in Philadelphia. Snow geese, the problems are occurring in the Arctic because we feed them so well with leftover corn and grain here in the southern U.S. that they can explode in populations up in the Arctic, and they have devastating consequences. But you can no longer manage that with hunting. So the organizational structure, the philosophies, everything else with state wildlife agencies created at a time where there was a paucity of or low abundance of the species that they were managing. That philosophy now needs to shift to how do you manage something that is so abundant that it creates ecologically negative impacts and negative human health impacts. And they haven't made that switch. They don't realize that, right? So something that was cool and appropriate 100 years ago no longer is appropriate when the conditions have changed fundamentally. And it's hard to get that into the heads and hearts. Nobody wants to outlaw recreational hunting, as I said before, but the hunters are not doing what we think they should be doing. And so you need to think creatively about how to do that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hey folks, thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You can always get in touch with us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com, and you can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. And of course, if you haven't already purchased Exploring Philly Nature, a guide for all 4 seasons, please go ahead and do it. You can find it at bookstores around Philadelphia, or you can find it online at all the usual online booksellers or directly from Temple University Press. Thanks again.